Maplewood Estates was the kind of neighborhood that inspired people to take walks after dinner. Green lawns lined both sides of the gently curving streets. Well-maintained houses sat in symmetrical rows, each with bright, flower-strewn gardens. If you drove along Red Maple Drive, you would eventually arrive at the local park, a small but charming haven dotted with benches and shade-providing sugar maples. The residents took pride in how neat and picturesque their community appeared. They credited part of that to the seemingly watchful eye of the HOA. Though who exactly was watching so diligently was a matter of private jokes and whispered complaints. In the middle of the neighborhood was a modest two-story home belonging to Mary Walters, an elderly widow who had lived there for decades. She had seen the neighborhood evolve from a dirt road development into a flourishing suburb. Her late husband, Fred, had planted 2 towering oaks in the front yard during their first year in Maplewood Estates. They were now so large they provided shade that spanned halfway across the street. Neighbors often recalled how the Walters family used to host 4th of July barbecues for the entire block, and Mary herself was known for her gentle demeanor and impeccable flower arrangements. On a gentle Saturday afternoon, Mary sat on her porch swing with a glass of iced tea, watching robins flit among the high branches. There was a time when she would invite neighbors to join her, but after Fred's passing a few years ago, she had grown quieter, focusing on her garden and the memories she shared with her children, who were now scattered around the country, each busy with their own families and careers. Mary's old bones ached if she stood for too long, but she still took her daily walk around the block when she felt up to it. She cherished the calm routine of a retiree's life. That afternoon seemed no different from many others, except that 2 blocks away, trouble was beginning to stir. Trouble that would eventually come pounding on Mary's door and painting hateful words on her fence. The truth was that Maplewood Estates had a problem, one that people rarely admitted out loud. That problem came in the form of Brenda Harwood, newly elected as a sort of enforcer on the HOA board. People who interacted with her frequently likened the experience to being scolded by a self-appointed hall monitor. Brenda was the type of woman who marched around in heels that clacked against the pavement so loudly you'd hear her coming half a block away. She wore her hair in a short, carefully styled bob, always fussing with it while telling others what to do. She was pushy, cunning in her own unsubtle way, and believed the entire neighborhood needed her personal brand of oversight. Over the last few months, she'd been amping up her efforts, leaving strongly worded notices on people's doors whenever she spotted a minor violation in their yard. Flower beds that needed a trim, mailboxes that lacked a fresh coat of paint, fences that didn't match the approved color palette. Nothing escaped Brenda's hawk-like glare. The hush of that Saturday afternoon was therefore misleading. For beneath the sunlit neighborhood calm, an undercurrent of discontent was spreading, and Mary, quietly sipping tea on her front porch, was about to find herself in the center of a storm she never asked for. In the hush of her tidy living room, Brenda Harwood snapped shut an HOA ledger with a decisive click. She felt an unwavering sense of purpose. As the self-declared neighborhood watchwoman, she took it upon herself to roam the streets daily and check for any new violations. It was almost comedic how quickly Maplewood Estates residents had begun referring to her by the moniker Karen, though never to her face. The nickname had taken on legendary status among the younger families. Even older, more polite couples whispered Karen's coming whenever they heard the tap-tap-tap of her heels. Brenda believed she was saving the community from descending into chaos. In reality, she was micromanaging every facet of Maplewood life, from the number of trash cans allowed on the curb to the acceptable brightness of porch lights. In her eyes, maintaining the proper standards of Maplewood Estates was a mission of the highest importance. It mattered little to her that many neighbors found her approach abrasive. The morning sun streamed in through her pristine bay windows, illuminating a living room decorated with color-coordinated cushions and an array of live, laugh, love plaques. She made one final note in her ledger regarding overgrown hedges at 1248 Birch Lane, and then grabbed her phone. With that, she sent out a mass text to the HOA board. "We need to discuss the unkempt state of property at 1248 Birch, ASAP." Also, have you noticed Mary Walters' fence in disrepair? Let's rectify that this week. Brenda. The tone, though polite on the surface, carried an undercurrent of command. Brenda's messages never suggested, they insisted. If someone did not respond quickly, she would call them until they picked up, ignoring any notion of personal privacy. She set the phone down and thought back to a conversation she'd had with Mary Walters a few months earlier. Mary had politely listened as Brenda lectured her about the fence in her backyard, which had been around since Mary and Fred first moved in. The wood was aging, some planks were rotting, and small cracks had begun to appear. Mary had thanked Brenda for the input, but insisted she would handle the matter when she had enough saved for major home repairs. That was not the answer Brenda wanted. Since then, Brenda had fixated on Mary Walters. In Brenda's eyes, Mary's fence was not just a cosmetic issue. It was a sign of disobedience, a slight to the very authority of the HOA. That day, Brenda resolved to pay Mary a visit. After all, it was time to remind her of the seriousness of maintaining the community's aesthetic standards. If Mary didn't comply soon, there would be consequences. Placing her ledger under one arm, Brenda put on her sunglasses and stepped out into the sunshine, ready to wage yet another battle for Maplewood Estate's integrity. Unaware of just how far her own aggression would take her, Brenda made a beeline for Mary's house, her heels clicking on the pavement like a metronome of approaching conflict. That afternoon, Mary's doorbell rang 3 times in quick succession. Startled, Mary rose from her rocking chair, smoothing down the front of her flowery blouse. She had been organizing photo albums of her grandchildren, smiling at pictures of their birthday parties and dance recitals. The doorbell's urgent tone made her heart skip a beat. When Mary opened the door, there stood Brenda Harwood, ledger clutched under her arm, wearing a rigid smile that never reached her eyes. "Good afternoon, Mary," Brenda said in a falsely sweet voice. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything too important." Mary, ever polite, invited her in, but Brenda waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, that's all right. I won't stay long. I just wanted to quickly chat about your backyard fence." Mary felt a familiar knot in her stomach. "Oh, the fence. Yes, I remember you mentioned it. I'm afraid the repairs are a bit too expensive for me right now." Brenda's tight grin hardened. "Mary, you've had months. The HOA guidelines are quite explicit. All fences must be maintained in proper condition. If the wood is rotting, it's a safety hazard and a visual blight on the neighborhood." She tapped her foot on the porch step. "Surely we don't want the rest of Maplewood Estates looking shabby, do we?" Mary's hand trembled slightly on the doorknob. "I understand, Brenda. I'm not ignoring the problem. I'm just waiting to gather enough funds. I'm on a fixed income, and I want to get it done correctly the first time. You know how these contractor quotes can be." Brenda's eyes flicked to the old rocking chair on the porch, then back to Mary's face. "If money is the issue," she said slowly, "have you considered that it might be easier just to move somewhere else?" She gave a condescending shrug, as though this were a perfectly logical suggestion to foist upon someone who had called Maplewood Estates home for decades. Mary blinked, struggling to find a polite response. "This is my home," she said. "I'm not looking to move. My children grew up here." Yes, of course," Brenda replied, though her tone was thick with sarcasm. "But sometimes it's best for the community if we all recognize when it's time for changes. Why burden yourself with expensive repairs if this house is too large for you now?" Mary's cheeks flushed. She couldn't believe Brenda's sheer audacity, telling her to leave. "I'm quite all right here," Mary said with forced calm. "Thank you for your concern." Brenda offered a thin-lipped smile. "Well, I tried to help. I'll let the board know that you're still not addressing the fence. We'll see what can be done." With that, she turned and strutted off. Mary closed the door, her hands shaking. Despite her attempts to remain calm, tears prickled her eyes. She felt threatened in her own home. This wasn't how Maplewood Estates used to be. Once upon a time, neighbors helped each other paint fences. Now, they threatened each other with citations and forced relocations. Little did Mary know, this unpleasant visit was only the tip of the iceberg. Brenda's obsession with fixing perceived violations would soon escalate into an act of outright aggression, leaving an ugly mark not just on Mary's fence, but on the spirit of the entire neighborhood. A few days after Brenda's visit, Mary ventured into her backyard to inspect the fence herself. The structure was composed of tall wooden planks, once of vivid cedar color, but now dulled by decades of sun and rain. Fred had built the fence himself, measuring each board with meticulous care. Since Fred's passing, Mary had done her best to keep it stained and in decent condition, but it was undeniably old. Several boards were splitting, nails jutted out at odd angles. She ran her fingertips along the rough grain. She thought about Fred, about how proud he had been of every little DIY project in the house. She could almost imagine his calloused hands sanding down the boards. A wave of nostalgia and sadness washed over her. Brenda's threats stung more deeply because this fence wasn't just old lumber. It was a piece of her personal history. That afternoon, Mary called one of her sons, Kyle, who lived 2 states away. He answered on the second ring. "Mom, everything okay?" She managed a small laugh. "Oh, I'm all right, sweetheart. I just wanted some advice. The HOA is giving me trouble about the backyard fence. I need to fix it or replace it, but the quotes I've gotten are rather high." "HOA trouble again, huh?" Kyle sounded frustrated. "Remember last year they complained about the color of your shutters? I thought that was all sorted out." Mary shrugged, though her son couldn't see her. "Yes, that was after the new board took over. They have a stricter approach now. It's primarily this lady named Brenda, who's determined to enforce every tiny rule. I was hoping maybe you could recommend a more affordable contractor or know someone who can do it for a fair price." Kyle promised to ask around. Still, Mary could sense an underlying worry in his voice. He even suggested she come live with him for a while, at least until she could find a cheaper place to retire. But Mary insisted she wanted to stay in her own home, a place filled with memories of Fred and her children. After all, Maplewood Estates was more than just an address. It was her life. By the time the call ended, it was late afternoon, and Mary found herself gazing at the fence again. The mere thought of losing the place where she raised her family weighed heavily on her heart. She remembered how the neighborhood used to gather for potlucks and block parties. Back then, community meant support, not intimidation. The prospect of letting Brenda chase her away felt like a betrayal of Fred's memory. Yet Mary sensed the conflict was far from over. Brenda had implied there would be consequences for failing to comply, and a menacing glint in her eyes seemed all too real. Mary wondered how far Brenda would go. It wasn't long before the rest of Maplewood Estates felt the ripples from Brenda's increased zeal. A family at the end of Acorn Street found a neon pink warning notice taped to their front door because their basketball hoop was supposedly too tall, according to some obscure clause in the HOA bylaws. Another resident, a single mom named Sophie, was reprimanded because her roses were encroaching on the sidewalk, though they were only lightly brushing passersby. Before Brenda's reign, the HOA had primarily focused on major issues, such as large-scale renovations, extremely unkempt lawns, or dangerous property damage. There had always been a sense of reason and neighborly tolerance. However, with Brenda steering the ship, that balance had given way to authoritarian micromanagement. An impromptu neighborhood watch group formed, ironically intended to watch out for Brenda's next moves. Members texted each other whenever they spotted her van cruising the streets. The group consisted of residents who felt harassed, the family with the tall basketball hoop, Sophie with her roses, a retired couple scolded for having a garden gnome that supposedly violated aesthetic guidelines, and many more. It was an eclectic bunch, united by a shared frustration. Mary, however, stayed mostly out of these group chats. She received the texts but often didn't reply. She was too drained. Her energy was consumed by finding a feasible solution for her fence. She found a few contractors who could do partial repairs at a lower cost, but they insisted it wouldn't last long because the fence was too old. A total replacement was the expensive route Brenda kept pushing. Mary still held out hope that if she did enough patchwork, the HOA might give her a break. Little did Mary realize that Brenda had no interest in giving her a break. Brenda needed a trophy case, an example to show the rest of the neighborhood what happened if they defied the guidelines. And in her mind, Mary's aging fence was the perfect example. A week passed, Mary had nearly convinced herself that maybe Brenda had decided to relent. Maybe she had shifted her focus to other houses. Then, on a quiet Friday night, the unthinkable happened. It was past midnight, and Mary was dozing in front of the television. The flickering images of an old sitcom cast dancing shadows on the living room walls. Suddenly, she heard a scraping noise coming from her backyard. At first, she thought it might be a raccoon rummaging in the trash bins. But something fell off. There was a more deliberate scratching sound, like metal dragging across wood. Uneasy, she switched off the TV and shuffled toward the sliding glass door that led to her backyard. The porch light was off, leaving the yard cloaked in darkness. Straining her eyes, she thought she glimpsed a silhouette moving near her fence. The shape was tall, hurried, and oddly stealthy. A prickle of fear ran down her spine. She reached for the porch light switch, flipping it on. The yard was illuminated in a warm yellow glow, but by then, the silhouette had darted out of sight. All that remained was the faint echo of fast footsteps on the pavement beyond her fence. Her heart hammered in her chest, a swirl of confusion and dread swirling in her mind. What had that person been doing? She recalled the stories she'd heard on the news. Vandals, thieves. Even though Maplewood Estates was considered a safe community, no place was immune to wrongdoing. She quickly locked the door and turned on additional lights. Though trembling, she mustered the courage to slide the door open just enough to step onto the porch. Moving carefully, she grabbed a flashlight she kept by the kitchen door for emergencies. She shone it along the fence's length. Her breath caught in her throat. In giant, jagged letters, someone had spray-painted a message across the weathered boards. "Get out." Tears welled in Mary's eyes as she read and reread the hateful words. Fear and sadness gripped her soul. Who would do such a thing? She felt violated, attacked in her own home. Half an hour later, she was still sitting on her couch, phone in hand, heart pounding, trying to decide whether to call the police. Little did she know that by daybreak, the entire neighborhood would know of this shocking act, and it would spark a movement that Brenda Harwood never anticipated. At sunrise, Mary gathered enough courage to venture back outside to assess the damage in the daylight. The letters were even more ominous in the early morning glow, lurid red strokes that screamed at anyone who passed by. "Get out." She stood there, blinking back tears, wondering if she should call her children again, or if she should contact the police. An empty ache hollowed out her chest. Before Mary had even made a decision, her next-door neighbor, a kind woman named Janet, stepped out to pick up her newspaper. She caught sight of Mary's fence and gasped, dropping the paper onto the curb. "Mary!" Janet exclaimed, rushing over. "Oh my goodness! Who would do this?" Mary shook her head slowly. I don't know," she stammered. She told Janet about the noises in the night, about flicking on her porch light too late to see the vandal's face. Janet put a comforting hand on Mary's shoulder. "We have to report this," she said firmly. "This isn't just graffiti, it's a threat." Janet called the police on Mary's behalf, who arrived within half an hour. 2 officers took down the details, took photos of the graffiti, and asked if Mary had any idea who might have done this. Mary was too rattled to point fingers, but Janet didn't hesitate to mention Brenda Harwood's ongoing harassment. The officers exchanged knowing looks but made no immediate accusations. They told Mary they would file a report and keep an eye out for suspicious activity. After they left, a wave of neighbors began trickling by, having heard the sirens or seen the flashing lights. Some of them snapped pictures of the vandalism, posting them to the neighborhood watch group text chain. Within minutes, the photos were everywhere, the community collectively outraged by this flagrant act of intimidation. What alarmed them more than anything was the message itself. "Get out." People whispered among themselves that it was obviously aimed at forcing Mary to move. While Maplewood Estates had never experienced a violent hate crime or threatening vandalism, there was little doubt this was a malicious attempt to scare Mary away. The question on everyone's mind was, who was responsible? Brenda Harwood was sipping her morning coffee when she opened her phone to find a barrage of notifications. Texts from the HOA board, photos of Mary Walters' fence plastered with the horrifying graffiti. Her immediate reaction was a mix of shock and annoyance. This was not how she wanted to maintain order. She cringed at the overly blunt message, "Get out." As controlling and invasive as Brenda was, she preferred intimidation through official letters, threats of fines, and the slow churn of official processes. A blatant act of vandalism reeked of desperation and thuggery. Still, a small part of her cynically mused that if Mary left, the fence problem would, in fact, be solved. But she had not planned it this way. In fact, her face hardened with worry. If the police or the neighbors began suspecting her, this could turn her entire precious HOA board against her. She valued her power far too much to risk losing it over something so brazen. She marched out to her driveway and slid into her meticulously polished SUV. Within minutes, she was at Mary's doorstep. There, she found a small gathering of neighbors comforting Mary, who was still visibly shaken. Tension rippled through the group the moment they saw Brenda approach. "Mary, dear," Brenda said in her carefully measured tone, "I just heard the terrible news." I'm shocked." She pursed her lips in a practiced display of concern. Mary glanced up, eyes red-rimmed. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, though her voice lacked warmth. Brenda turned to the fence, surveying the garish letters. She let out a theatrical gasp, placing a hand on her chest. "This is absolutely unacceptable. Please know that the HOA does not condone vandalism of any kind. We'll do whatever we can to support you." A couple of neighbors exchanged doubtful looks, unsure whether Brenda was being genuine. Janet folded her arms. "Brenda, do you have any idea who might have done this? The officers asked us if there was anyone with a motive." Brenda stiffened. For a moment, her mask of concern slipped, revealing the cornered predator beneath. She forced a neutral expression. "Well, we can't go throwing around baseless accusations," she said, voice tight. "Of course, Mary and I have had our differences about the fence, but I would never stoop to such a criminal act." She let her words hang in the air. It was hard to read Mary's expression, but she simply nodded and turned away. Brenda stepped forward, lowering her voice as if speaking confidentially. "Mary, if you need help covering this graffiti until you can get the fence fixed, I can recommend some quick solutions. We can paint over it, perhaps with a color that matches HOA guidelines." Janet couldn't hold back a scoff. "The guidelines again? Seriously, Brenda?" Brenda pressed her lips together, ignoring the jab. She cast her eyes around at the cluster of neighbors, and for once, her presence didn't command the usual fear or compliance. Instead, there was an undercurrent of suspicion, even hostility. She straightened her shoulders, quickly bid Mary farewell, and hurried back to her SUV, the hollow clack of her heels echoing down the driveway. For Brenda, it was time to pivot. She needed to distance herself from this crime and reassert her influence. But for the rest of Maplewood Estates, it was the moment they realized that for all her claims of improving the neighborhood, Brenda might be an even bigger threat to their sense of community than the vandalism itself. Despite the trauma of discovering such a hateful message on her fence, Mary soon found an outpouring of support from neighbors who rallied around her. Over the weekend, a stream of visitors brought baked goods, fresh groceries, and offers to help repaint the fence. Each person who arrived expressed a mixture of shock and righteous anger at the graffiti, as well as genuine compassion for Mary's well-being. Many insisted on at least helping her cover the words until she decided on a more permanent solution. Janet was the first to propose an idea that would eventually grow into something far more symbolic. "Mary," she said, setting down a Tupperware container of homemade cookies on Mary's kitchen counter, "what if we don't just paint over it in plain color? What if we put something beautiful there, something that reflects this neighborhood's sense of unity?" Mary tilted her head in curiosity. "What do you mean? You know how the local park has murals painted by kids and local artists?" Janet's eyes sparkled. "We could do something like that on your fence, a mural that represents the community's support for one another. It would be a direct response to that hateful message. Turn it into something positive." Mary hesitated, though the idea lit a tiny spark of hope in her. "I think that a lovely idea, but would the HOA allow it? Janet's lips set into a determined line. Under normal circumstances, maybe they'd throw a fit. But these aren't normal circumstances. Someone vandalized your fence with a threatening message. Replacing it might take time you can't afford right now. Painting a mural is a temporary solution, but it's also a statement. Let the HOA try to fight that, especially with all the community support we'll have behind you. Word of Janet's idea spread quickly, and within a day, a group chat formed around the theme of transform Mary's fence into a symbol of unity. Dozens of residents pledged to help, volunteering their time, painting skills, and supplies. Even those who had never painted anything more complex than a bedroom wall felt compelled to contribute. Families talked about bringing their children to leave their mark, using handprints or small shapes to celebrate the spirit of neighbors helping neighbors. Mary was deeply moved, although she worried it would draw more ire from Brenda. But the more she dwelled on it, the more she realized she had little left to lose. Whoever had painted "Get Out" on her fence had done more than just ruin a few planks of wood. They had attempted to rob her of her sense of safety. If painting a mural gave her back some agency and turned the hateful words on their head, she was determined to support it. By the end of the weekend, the plan was set. On Saturday morning, the neighbors would gather at Mary's house with paint cans, brushes, ladders, and a shared vision. Transform something ugly into something undeniably beautiful. The day after Mary and Janet finalized the mural plans, Brenda Harwood received a phone call from another HOA board member, Mr. Garcia. He was a mild-mannered retiree who had joined the board thinking he could help with administrative tasks, never anticipating the drama that Brenda would bring. "Brenda," he said, voice cautious, "I've been getting calls about Mary Walters' fence. The neighbors plan to paint a mural over the graffiti. I know this is a tricky situation, but maybe we could show our support and let them do it without complaint." Brenda felt a surge of indignation. A mural? That would surely stand out, potentially clashing with the strict color palette of Maplewood Estates. "I don't think that's wise," she replied icily. "We need uniformity here, not chaos. Besides, imagine the precedent it sets. Anyone could go around painting walls and fences in bright, clashing colors." Mr. Garcia sighed. "With all due respect, it's not the same as random graffiti. This is a community-driven project to support Mary. After she was essentially attacked, we should be behind her." Brenda ground her teeth. She prided herself on controlling the narrative within Maplewood Estates, and this mural idea threatened to undermine her authority. But she also knew that openly opposing it, after the vandalism, could make her look heartless, or worse, suspicious. "That fence isn't safe," she said, changing tack. "We've told Mary repeatedly it needs replacing. If they paint it, they'll just be dressing up rotten planks. We can encourage her to replace it eventually, but in the meantime, this is a heartfelt gesture from the community. Wouldn't it be better to support it? It's good PR for the HOA to stand by a resident who was threatened." Brenda hated the logic, but recognized she was cornered. Publicly shutting down a community act of solidarity was a terrible look. Besides, any further negativity might raise eyebrows about her involvement in the whole ordeal. She forced a measured tone. "Fine, but I want them to submit a formal request for a temporary decorative measure. We can call an HOA meeting to discuss how long that mural can stay. Because once that fence is replaced, it needs to follow the guidelines." Mr. Garcia nodded. "I'll let them know." The moment she hung up, Brenda exhaled sharply. Tension coiled in her chest. She could already see the headlines on the Maplewood Estates Facebook group. "Community mural painted in solidarity with Mary Walters." She clenched her fists. If she wasn't careful, this collective act of unity would overshadow her entire regime of rules. And that was something she simply could not allow. Saturday dawned with a bright sun gleaming over Maplewood Estates. By 9 in the morning, Mary's backyard was bustling. A folding table had been set up on the grass, laden with paint cans, donations from neighbors who'd rummaged through their garages and basements for leftover colors. There were big brushes, small brushes, rollers, drop cloths, and trays, all neatly arranged. A cooler sat at one corner, filled with bottled water and lemonade, and various neighbors brought trays of sandwiches, cookies, and fruit. Mary woke up early, a warm sense of gratitude filling her despite the underlying anxiety. She never would have imagined so many people coming together on her behalf. By 9:30, at least 20 residents were there. Families with young children, college students home for the summer, retirees looking for ways to help. Some were old friends, some were near strangers, but all shared the same resolve: to reclaim Mary's fence from hateful words. Janet, armed with a piece of chalk, sketched outlines on the fence where the biggest letters of "Get Out" still showed. The plan was to incorporate each letter into the mural's design, to transform the negativity into something that symbolized unity. As she chalked, children hovered around excitedly, waiting for the moment they could dip their brushes into bright blues, yellows, and reds. The mood was festive, almost like a block party. Neighbors chatted amiably, forging new connections. Sophie, the single mom singled out by Brenda for her encroaching roses, laughed with another neighbor about how they could incorporate floral designs into the mural. A teenage boy who had received a citation for his too tall basketball hoop offered to paint sports silhouettes around the fence perimeter. A retired art teacher, Mrs. Whitaker, took charge of organizing the color scheme so the final design would blend harmoniously. And in the middle of it all was Mary, her eyes sparkling with tears of gratitude. Every so often, someone would come up and give her a gentle hug, offering words of encouragement. Through the swirl of activity, Mary noticed that even neighbors who she didn't know well were introducing themselves, shaking her hand, expressing how sorry they were about the vandalism. It felt like the best of what a neighborhood could be, neighbors uniting for a worthy cause, bridging generational gaps, and sharing in a collective creative endeavor. In a sense, the act of painting the mural was painting away not just the graffiti, but also the fear and anger it had caused. And yet, in the back of everyone's minds, there was an awareness that the HOA might still interfere. Word had spread that Brenda had begrudgingly allowed the project for now. While they worked, many kept an eye out for her arrival, bracing for the kind of conflict that always seemed to erupt whenever Brenda showed her face. By mid-morning, the painting was well underway. The hateful words had been carefully covered, with each stroke of color turning the ominous red letters into graceful arcs of sunshine, leaves, and flowers. Mrs. Whitaker guided the children in painting a border of vines and blossoms along the bottom edge of the fence, cleverly absorbing the scrawled G and E of "Get" into petals and swirling leaves. Meanwhile, Sophie led another group in painting a stylized version of Maplewood's iconic trees. The design featured tall maple trees with swirling canopies in autumn colors, a symbolic nod to the name of their neighborhood and the vibrant unity they all shared. The leftover red paint from the original graffiti was ironically repurposed as part of the maple leaves, weaving that negativity into something breathtakingly positive. Next, the teenage boy with the basketball hoop citation painted silhouettes of people of different ages and backgrounds holding hands near the base of the fence. This formed a chain of unity that stretched across multiple boards, reminding everyone that Maplewood Estates was a community meant for all. Every new addition to the mural seemed to bring fresh waves of excitement. Passers-by stopped on the street, calling out words of praise. Cameras clicked, and a local blogger who lived nearby decided to livestream parts of the mural's progress on social media. Within a couple of hours, dozens of comments poured in, applauding Maplewood Estates for its communal spirit. Some even expressed a wish for their own neighborhoods to show such solidarity in the face of adversity. Amidst the flurry of paint and chatter, Mary felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't experienced in years. She thought of Fred again, wishing he were here to see this outpouring of support and creativity. She imagined him wearing his old overalls, paint splattered from head to toe, laughing with the kids while he offered them tips on holding the brush. The image brought both tears and a smile to Mary's face. If the vandal had intended to isolate and terrify her, their plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead, the entire community had rallied to transform an act of hatred into an explosion of beauty and kindness. At around noon, as the mural reached a halfway point, the crowd's mood remained jovial. Then, like a dark cloud passing over a sunny field. Brenda's SUV turned the corner. The unmistakable clack of her heels soon followed. Conversations hushed briefly, and a few people tensed, anticipating confrontation. Brenda approached the crowd around Mary's fence, wearing oversized sunglasses that did little to hide her scowl. She scanned the half-finished mural, taking in the colorful shapes and bright designs. Her expression was unreadable, teetering between disapproval and reluctant acknowledgement of the project's artistry. Janet, paintbrush in hand, was the first to greet her. "Afternoon, Brenda. We're making good progress. Care to join us?" she asked with a hint of sarcasm. Brenda offered a tight-lipped smile. "I'm not here to paint," she said, her tone brisk. "I'm here in an official capacity. The HOA board wants to ensure the mural is properly documented as a temporary solution." She turned to Mary, who stood nearby. "Mary, I assume you understand that once you replace this fence, and we still expect you to do so, you'll need to follow the HOA-approved guidelines for fence color and design." Mary swallowed. Her voice was shaky but resolute. "I'll replace it when I can afford to, Brenda. Until then, this is what we're doing." Brenda nodded curtly, then pulled out her phone and began snapping pictures of the mural, presumably for official records. The crowd of painters eyed her warily. The presence of the woman, known mockingly as Karen, among them felt intrusive, even more so because of the raw memory of the vandalism. Many suspected her involvement, though no one dared voice that suspicion outright, at least not yet. "Make sure you don't drip paint onto the ground," Brenda lectured, pointing her phone in different directions. "We wouldn't want any chemical runoff issues, would we?" A few of the younger volunteers rolled their eyes, but they continued painting in silence. Even in the midst of communal creativity, Brenda's presence cast a minor pall over the festivities. After a few more minutes, she pocketed her phone and announced, "I'll let the board know how far along you've come. Remember, this mural is a courtesy extended by the HOA, given the extenuating circumstances. Let's hope it doesn't violate any local ordinances." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and strode away, leaving a swirl of hushed discontent in her wake. Once her SUV disappeared around the corner, the energy among the painters slowly returned to a cheerful hum. Some joked about how the mural had passed the inspection of the Queen, and others, in a more serious tone, remarked on Brenda's nerve to show up with her own brand of intimidation even now. But nothing could dampen the communal spirit for long. They had come too far to let one woman's sour disposition ruin a day devoted to healing and solidarity. Throughout the afternoon, brushes swished and laughter abounded. A local musician appeared with a guitar, singing softly while people painted. Children giggled, covering their hands in different colors to leave whimsical prints on the lower boards of the fence. The final design was an ever-evolving tapestry of nature, unity, and creative flourishes, from butterflies and birds to family silhouettes. The hateful message that once glared from the wood was now entirely subsumed by a kaleidoscope of color, line, and shape. By late afternoon, the once threatening red letters of "Get Out" had vanished, blended seamlessly into the large maple leaves and swirling motifs that danced across Mary's fence. Several neighbors took a step back and marveled at the transformation. The mural extended the entire length of the fence, roughly 50 feet of bright, communal artistry. It was impossible not to smile when looking at it. Mary watched this final unveiling with tears sparkling in her eyes. She raised her hands in a gesture of thanks to everyone gathered. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "I've never felt so touched by my neighbors. Fred would have loved to see this. I only hope you all know how grateful I am." A cheer rose up around her. People clapped, hugged her, and took a flood of photos to capture the triumphant moment. In those snapshots were the smiles of children, the proud grins of older residents, and the glistening tears in Mary's eyes. Images that told a story of community standing firm against intimidation. Mrs. Whitaker, who had played a major role in coordinating the design, gestured toward the final product. "Mary, you're not the only one who's grateful. This fence has reminded all of us what it means to be neighbors. It's not about abiding by a never-ending list of rules. It's about caring for each other. Sophie nodded. Besides, it's not just for Mary. This mural belongs to every single person in Maplewood Estates. It's a symbol that if one of us is threatened, we all come together. A unifying applause followed. In that moment, the fence was no longer just Mary's property. It had become a masterpiece of shared resilience, an emblem of how a neighborhood could respond to hatred with unity and love. And for the first time in a while, Mary felt truly at peace in her own backyard, enveloped by the warm glow of community support. On Monday evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting to address the situation at Mary's fence. Brenda had called for it, hoping to remind the board that the mural was only a temporary fix and that Mary was still under a deadline to replace the fence entirely. But the other board members, who had seen firsthand the supportive outpouring from the neighborhood, entered the meeting with different priorities. Mr. Garcia opened the meeting in a calm, steady voice. First, we'd like to acknowledge that what happened to Mary's fence was a criminal act. None of us condone it, and I trust the police are continuing their investigation. Heads nodded around the room. Brenda sat at one end of the long conference table, her expression tight. Several neighbors attended in the audience, having come to witness or speak out about the matter. Among them was Janet, who had already prepared a statement in defense of the mural. Mr. Garcia continued, "We also recognize that the neighbors have transformed the vandalism into a truly inspiring community project. The mural on Mary's fence is, by all accounts, beautiful and unifying." A small round of applause broke out from the audience. Brenda cleared her throat, tapping her pen sharply on the table. "While that might be so," she said, "we must not lose sight of the fact that the fence is in disrepair. The HOA guidelines exist for a reason, to maintain safety and property values. Are we going to simply ignore the structural issues and let a potentially hazardous fence stand because of a coat of paint?" Janet raised her hand from the audience. Mr. Garcia recognized her, and she spoke. "Mary has every intention to fix or replace her fence when she's financially able. We've got some volunteers willing to help with manual labor and materials. The question is, can we allow this mural to remain as a symbol of solidarity until then?" Several neighbors nodded vigorously. One of them stood up. "We also asked the HOA to consider the morale it brings to the neighborhood. This wasn't just random paint thrown around. It was a coordinated effort of unity in response to a hateful act." Brenda pursed her lips. "No one here is against unity," she said, though her tone was icy. "But rules are rules, and we can't just make exceptions whenever." She was cut off by another board member, Ms. Daniels, who rarely spoke but now leaned forward. "Brenda, let's be realistic. An exception has already been made. The entire fence has been transformed into a mural. The community is behind Mary. I believe we should officially approve a temporary waiver while Mary arranges for the eventual replacement of the fence." Brenda's face tightened, but she saw that the majority of her fellow board members were in agreement with Ms. Daniels. Resisting outright would only paint her as the villain, especially in the wake of such an egregious act of vandalism. "Very well," she said in a clipped voice. "I suppose that's what we'll do." The board then voted, and the verdict was unanimous. Mary's mural would remain, with an understanding that when the time came, Mary could replace her fence in a way that honored the neighborhood's rules, while allowing for some creative homage to the original mural if she so wished. A rousing applause filled the room. Brenda felt her authority slipping like sand through her fingers. She stood abruptly, gathering her papers. "Meeting adjourned," she said, forcing a tight smile as she walked out. For the first time, the residents of Maplewood Estates felt the board had genuinely sided with them over the relentless dictates of their self-proclaimed Karen. And in that moment, the mural wasn't just paint on wood. It was a tangible sign of Brenda's waning grip on the hearts and minds of the neighborhood. In the days following the HOA's decision, Maplewood Estates buzzed with rumors about who had actually spray-painted Mary's fence. The police had no hard evidence pointing to Brenda or anyone else, but the Neighborhood Watch group openly speculated about her involvement. The most common theory was that Brenda had grown impatient with Mary's refusal to comply and decided to scare her off. Outwardly, Brenda acted offended by such accusations, telling anyone who would listen that she had no motive for doing something so low and petty. She insisted she used only legitimate channels to address violations, never vandalism. But her protests did little to quell the suspicions. Meanwhile, Mary tried not to dwell on who was responsible. She found herself overwhelmed by gratitude for the new, colorful fence she saw each morning. She also noticed how the mural was now drawing passers-by who might linger and chat with her, a stark contrast to the isolation she'd felt before. The fence had become a local attraction, a physical representation of shared values triumphing over hate. Yet a lingering tension hung in the air. Many neighbors wanted justice, not just for Mary, but to ensure that Maplewood Estates was purged of the mentality that resorted to threats. Some pressed the police for updates, but there were no leads. No witnesses besides Mary, who hadn't seen the perpetrator's face. The single security camera that might have caught the act had, sadly, not been recording that night. Over time, some began to suspect that even if Brenda had commissioned someone else to do the dirty work, proof was scarce. Without tangible evidence, there would be no closure, only the silent understanding that Brenda was capable of far more malicious actions than her usual petty citations. Regardless of the rumor mill's churn, the neighborhood found solace in the mural. Children still came by to add small touches of paint or sign their names discreetly along the vines. Sophie planted fresh flowers along the fence base, and the family at the end of Acorn Street, the one with the too-tall basketball hoop, donated a small birdhouse that was attached to one of the fence posts. Mary's once derelict fence had become a living symbol of resilience. One sunny afternoon, about a week after the mural's completion, a local TV news reporter named Amanda Lynn arrived in Maplewood Estates. She had seen pictures of the fence on social media, noticed the strong community response, and thought it would make a heartwarming human interest story. Amanda knocked on Mary's door with a warm smile. "Mrs. Walters, hi. I'm Amanda from Channel 6 News. I'd love to do a short segment on what your neighborhood achieved after such a hateful incident. Would you be willing to talk to me?" Mary, initially shy about being on TV, paused and then nodded with a quiet grace. She guided Amanda to the backyard, where the camera operator marveled at the vibrant colors of the mural. The lens captured the swirl of maple leaves, the outlines of neighbors hand in hand, and the bright flourishes of children's fingerprints near the bottom. The reporter was visibly moved. As they filmed, Amanda asked Mary gentle questions about the vandalism and the subsequent transformation. Mary recounted how terrifying it had been to see "Get Out" scrawled on her fence, but she glowed with emotion when she described how the community gathered to paint over it with love and unity. "The fence is old, and it still needs repairs," Mary said, her voice trembling a bit. "But right now, it feels like it's stronger than ever. I've never been more proud to live in Maplewood Estates." Amanda smiled encouragingly. "Mrs. Walters, what's your message to anyone watching who might be going through a similar situation?" Mary looked at the mural, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. "Don't let fear or hate push you out of your home. Sometimes the best way to fight back is not by lashing out, but by creating something beautiful together with people who care." The reporter nodded, visibly touched by Mary's words. Once they finished the interview, Amanda filmed a few more shots of the fence and spoke briefly with a couple of neighbors who had contributed to the mural. She thanked Mary and promised to air the story soon. That evening, Brenda, watching the local news, nearly choked on her tea when she saw Maplewood Estates featured. The camera panned across the fence, capturing all its vivid glory, while Mary's voiceover explained how the community had united to stamp out an act of vandalism. The segment ended with Amanda praising the neighborhood spirit and remarking on how positivity had won out. Furious, Brenda changed the channel. She felt overshadowed, sidelined, and powerless. The fence was now a celebrated icon of communal solidarity. The more people applauded it, the less fear the residents had of her or her heavy-handed enforcement. The question for Brenda became, how could she possibly reassert control? In the days that followed the news segment, Brenda grew increasingly restless. The positive publicity around Mary's fence gnawed her. It felt like an indictment of her entire approach, strict, punitive, and fueled by intimidation. She heard the whispers at the grocery store, sensed the turned backs when she walked her route. Whether or not she had directly vandalized Mary's fence, the neighborhood sentiment was clear. She was the villain in Maplewood Estates. Brenda decided she needed a bold move to regain her status and prove that she was still in charge. She began drafting an official HOA letter to Mary, referencing the most minute rules about property maintenance, sections of fence missing nails, possible hazards for children, potential risk of falling boards. She planned to demand that Mary present a signed contract for fence replacement within 30 days. However, as she typed up her list of demands, she found herself hesitating. If she pushed too hard, it might confirm everyone's suspicion that she was harassing Mary specifically. She needed a broader approach, one that would encompass multiple violations and make it look like a standard policy enforcement rather than a personal vendetta. So Brenda spent the week scouring Maplewood Estates, snapping photos of anything that could be labeled a violation. A porch swing too close to the sidewalk, a shed whose paint was peeling, a row of hedges not trimmed to a uniform height. She compiled these into a thick stack of documents, each with a proposed fine. This would be the wave of intimidation that reestablished the HOA's authority, or so she hoped. When she presented her findings at the next board meeting, however, she was met with immediate pushback from Mr. Garcia, Ms. Daniels, and other members. They accused her of launching a witch hunt that only served to breed resentment. Most of these violations, they argued, were petty and easily resolved with friendly reminders, not punitive fines. Brenda erupted in frustration, slamming her palm on the conference table. No wonder this neighborhood is falling apart. None of you have the backbone to enforce the rules. Ms. Daniels, normally calm, squared her shoulders. Our job is to foster a sense of community, Brenda, not tear it down. The incident with Mary Walters should have taught us all that compassion and support bring us closer, while threats and aggression drive us apart. Brenda glared but said nothing. She snatched up her documents and stormed out, leaving the other board members exchanging worried looks. As far as they could see, Brenda's brand of tyranny was on the losing end of Maplewood's changing values. As Brenda fumed in her home, Maplewood Estates continued down a path of shared positivity. The mural on Mary's fence became a kind of informal gathering spot. When the weather was nice, neighbors would take strolls just to admire it, sometimes striking up conversations with Mary if they spotted her tending to her garden. Children from other streets would ride their bikes over after school, parking along the curb to visit the mural. Mary found herself offering them snacks or cups of lemonade, listening to their excited chatter. In some ways, the fence had made her backyard the most beloved space in the neighborhood. Beyond Mary's property, a subtle shift was happening. Spurred by the sense of unity the mural represented, neighbors began helping each other with small tasks. Driveways were swept by volunteers, rose bushes were pruned by friendly passers-by, and folks lent each other lawnmowers, shovels, and wheelbarrows without second thought. The sense of isolation that had permeated for so long, especially under Brenda's watchful, punitive eye, began to break down. Janet observed all this with growing pride. She and a few others decided to organize a Maplewood Community Day, an event reminiscent of the block parties they used to have before Brenda took over the HOA board. The idea was to showcase local talents, run a bake sale, and possibly raise funds for neighbors in need of home repairs, like Mary's fence. Word spread quickly, and the event garnered enthusiastic responses. When the flyer for Maplewood Community Day was posted on the neighborhood's online bulletin, the sign-up sheet filled up within hours. People offered to bring baked goods, homemade crafts, face painting for kids, and more. Musicians volunteered to play. Local businesses from the adjoining township expressed interest in sponsoring small prizes and donating supplies. Meanwhile, Brenda caught wind of this event. She considered whether to demand that the organizers submit forms for HOA approval, obtain noise permits, and follow a litany of other requirements. But after the pushback she had already encountered, she suspected no one would heed her meddling. On top of that, she faced a rising tide of discontent among the board members, who seemed tired of her confrontational methods. And so, Maplewood Estates pressed on without her blessing, forging a renewed sense of togetherness that left Brenda on the sidelines. For the first time in her tenure, she found herself powerless to assert her usual control, watching from a distance as the neighborhood grew stronger, united not by fear of her rules, but by collective empathy and community spirit. The big day arrived under a perfect blue sky. Maplewood Community Day took over the local park, complete with food stalls, picnic tables, and colorful banners strung between trees. Neighbors wearing name tags bustled about, greeting newcomers with smiles. A small stage had been assembled from plywood for local bands and performers. Children darted across the grass, their laughter mingling with the bright strum of guitar strings. Mary arrived with Janet, who helped carry her fold-up chair and a tote bag of crocheted scarves that Mary had decided to donate for a small fundraiser. Her eyes shimmered as she surveyed the vibrant scene. It reminded her of the old days when Maplewood Estates had hosted frequent get-togethers. Every corner teemed with life and camaraderie. Volunteers sold hot dogs and lemonade for $1 each, with proceeds earmarked for the Maplewood Fund, an informal kitty set up to help residents struggling with home repair costs. A sign near the donation box read, "All for one, one for all," referencing their newfound communal ethos. Toward midday, a local trio of acoustic musicians performed on stage, drawing a sizable crowd. People swayed and clapped, some singing along. Mary felt a warmth suffuse her heart, especially when she caught sight of more than a few folks wearing T-shirts with stylized prints of her fence mural. Janet had taken high-resolution photos of the mural and used them to create T-shirt designs, selling them to raise additional funds. It was surreal for Mary to see strangers wearing a depiction of her once vandalized fence, a fence that had turned into a beloved emblem. Halfway through the event, Ms. Daniels and Mr. Garcia called Mary to the stage. She came forward hesitantly, leaning on Janet for support. Ms. Daniels took the microphone. "Mary, on behalf of Maplewood Estates, we want to present you with this donation to help you replace your fence when you're ready." The outpouring of love from the neighborhood has been incredible. Mr. Garcia handed Mary an envelope while the crowd applauded. Tears filled her eyes. She opened it enough to see a stack of bills and checks. It was more than she had expected, likely enough to cover at least a significant chunk of the replacement cost. She raised the microphone to her lips, voice trembling. I don't know what to say. Thank you all so much. This community has been my home for decades, and Fred and I loved it dearly. In my wildest dreams, I never imagined something so awful could lead to something so wonderful. You all have shown me that real neighbors stand together, and I promise to keep paying that kindness forward. The crowd erupted in cheers. With misty eyes, Mary returned to her seat, enveloped by hugs from well-wishers. For the rest of the afternoon, the festivities continued with the energy of a renewed town, one that had faced down intimidation and found a deeper sense of togetherness. Brenda made a brief, stiff appearance, walking around the park in her usual heels, scanning the event as though searching for violations. But faced with the overwhelming positivity and the presence of her fellow HOA board members, she left without incident, her attempts at overshadowing the day utterly lost amid the crowd's celebration. Over the following weeks, Maplewood Estates basked in the afterglow of Community Day. While minor disputes still arose, this was suburban life. After all, residents dealt with them more compassionately. In group texts and casual porch gatherings, people shared ideas for improvements and ways to help neighbors in need. The transformation in atmosphere was almost palpable. Mary began exploring contractors for the fence replacement, buoyed by the funds she'd received. She spoke to Janet about possibly preserving a section of the mural before the old fence was torn down. Several neighbors loved the idea. One contractor suggested cutting out a few panels of the painted boards, framing them, and displaying them in Mary's backyard, turning them into a permanent art installation. Mary was thrilled by the possibility, envisioning those panels as a lasting tribute to the day the neighborhood chose unity over fear. Meanwhile, the HOA board underwent a subtle shift. Emboldened by the neighborhood's push for empathy-driven leadership, Mr. Garcia, Ms. Daniels, and a few others began drafting new guidelines that emphasize cooperation and community engagement rather than fines and punitive actions. They intended to present these at the next annual election, hoping to steer the HOA away from Brenda's iron-fisted style. Sensing her influence slip away, Brenda tried to drum up support for her stricter approach, but found few allies. After all the fuss over Mary's fence, more residents had grown disillusioned with the micromanagement. The once feared Karen found herself increasingly isolated, the magnitude of her miscalculations finally becoming clear. To Mary's relief, life returned to a peaceful rhythm. The mural remained untouched, a bright testament along her yard. Each morning, as she sipped her tea, she would look out at the swirling leaves and colorful silhouettes, drawing comfort from the knowledge that her neighbors were, indeed, good and kind. The tension of the past weeks felt like a distant nightmare. Despite her waning power, Brenda wasn't one to retreat gracefully. On a brisk morning, she filed a formal complaint to the city's municipal office about unregulated artwork on private fences. She hoped to bypass the HOA's softened stance and force Mary to remove the mural. When a city official arrived to inspect the fence, half the neighborhood turned out in Mary's backyard to greet him. He was a man of middle age, wearing an official badge and a clipboard. People offered him lemonade, walked him through the story of the vandalism, and showcased the community effort. Initially, he tried to remain neutral, checking if the mural violated any city ordinances on large-scale outdoor art. But after hearing everyone's accounts and seeing that the property owner, Mary, fully consented, he concluded that the city had no cause for complaint. There's nothing in the code that prohibits an owner from decorating their fence with a mural, as long as it's not a public eyesore or a safety hazard, the official declared. He commended the residents for their spirited response to vandalism. As for the graffiti that had sparked it all, he simply shook his head in dismay. Brenda, who had followed the official to Mary's backyard, scowled throughout the entire exchange. When the city official left, she tried cornering him by his car, insisting that the fence was deteriorating and needed immediate replacement. The official shrugged. "Ma'am, that's not a violation, so long as it's not in danger of collapse. If or when the homeowner decides to replace it, that's her choice." With that, he drove off, leaving Brenda standing there, seething. A few neighbors, seeing her frustration, couldn't resist murmuring small cheers under their breath. Brenda gave them a withering glare before storming back to her SUV. Within minutes, social media threads lit up with chatter about the city official's decision. Brenda's last stand had failed. The mural would stay, and Mary would proceed with her fence replacement on her own timetable. For Maplewood Estates, it was another triumphant moment, reinforcing the idea that real neighborhood power belonged not to a tyrannical HOA enforcer, but to the collective goodwill of the residents. With winter approaching, Mary decided it was best to replace the fence in the early spring, when weather conditions would be more favorable for outdoor construction. Her chosen contractor supported the idea, noting that the existing fence, though old, would hold up until then, especially after a few minor reinforcements. In the meantime, Mary cherished the mural. She invited neighbors over for small gatherings before the cold set in, offering homemade apple pies and mulled cider. People would sit in folding chairs, admiring the vibrant artwork and sharing stories. Each get-together felt like an affirmation of the unity that had blossomed in response to hate. Brenda, meanwhile, grew more and more isolated. Her reputation as Karen had reached a point where even mentioning her name elicited exasperated sighs. Some neighbors tried to be civil, but her cold demeanor and rigid insistence on petty rules pushed them away. She could sense the shift, though she refused to accept responsibility for her role in it. Late one afternoon, Brenda found herself alone in the HOA office, flipping through old records of Maplewood Estates. She came across photographs from years gone by, smiling residents, block parties, children running through sprinklers in the summer. A pang of envy and bitterness coursed through her. She realized that she had never been truly welcomed into the heart of the community. Her approach had always been about controlling others rather than working with them. Yet, pride stopped her from acknowledging that she had alienated the very people she purported to serve. Instead of bridging the gap, she sank deeper into resentment, convinced that Maplewood Estates simply didn't appreciate order. She left the office that evening with a hollow feeling in her chest, completely unaware that many residents pitted her more than they hated her. As Christmas lights began to brighten the neighborhood in late December, Mary's home glowed with a modest display. She hung a wreath on her front door and placed an electric candle in each window. The fence mural, though partially obscured by drifting snow, still peeked out with flashes of color near the base. One snowy afternoon, there was a knock at Mary's door. She opened it to find Brenda standing on her porch, cheeks flushed from the cold. Mary's first instinct was to brace for another lecture or thinly veiled threat. To her surprise, Brenda seemed hesitant. "Mary," she began, pausing to clear her throat, "I realize you'll be replacing your fence in the spring. I just wanted to say we, the HOA, appreciate your cooperation in following the guidelines." Her voice faltered. Even now, she couched her words in official jargon. Mary nodded politely. "Of course. I'm looking forward to preserving some of the painted boards before they come down." Brenda forced a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She glanced past Mary into the warmly lit hallway. Would you like help with anything in the meantime? We've had a lot of snow, and you might need someone to clear your driveway." Mary, taken aback, hesitated. "Oh, Janet's son usually helps me, but thank you for offering." She wondered if this was some new tactic. Yet Brenda's posture suggested genuine discomfort, as though she was trying to bridge a chasm but didn't know how. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the cold winter air swirling around them. Finally, Brenda swallowed. "I'm sorry, Mary," she said haltingly. "I know I've been hard on you about the fence. I might have gone too far." Mary searched Brenda's face. For the first time, there was a flicker of vulnerability behind the hard exterior. Slowly, Mary nodded. "I accept your apology, Brenda. Maybe in the future, we can find a way to work together, not against each other." Brenda gave a curt nod in return, then turned to leave. It was a tentative peace, albeit a strained one. Mary closed the door, unsure what to make of the interaction. Part of her wanted to believe Brenda was changing, while another part cautioned that old habits die hard. Regardless, Mary felt relief. Even if Brenda's apology was half-hearted, it was a small step toward closure. By the time spring arrived, Mary had finalized the contractor's plans for the new fence. She'd also arranged with a local carpenter to carefully remove and frame several of the mural boards before demolition. On a bright April morning, the crew arrived. Neighbors again gathered to witness the moment, many taking photos as the old fence was disassembled. A hush fell when the boards with the most striking parts of the mural were pried away. Each painted panel was handled gently, like a precious artifact. Mary stood by, tears in her eyes, as they wrapped the boards in protective blankets. The rest of the fence soon came down, nails screeching as they were pulled free of the posts. Bit by bit, the physical symbol of Maplewood's unity was taken apart, soon to be replaced by sturdy new planks. Yet none of it felt sad. The mural had done its job, and the best parts of it would live on, displayed prominently in Mary's backyard once the new fence was up. As the last fragments of the old boards were cleared away, the contractors set to work installing fresh cedar planks, ones that met all the HOA's guidelines for height, color, and structural integrity. It took several days to complete, but once done, Mary had a brand new fence lining her property. The wood had a warm, golden hue that gleamed in the spring sunlight. While it lacked the explosion of color the mural had provided, the knowledge that parts of that mural would soon hang on Mary's back porch felt like a comforting link to the past. Brenda stopped by once during construction, offering a polite nod to the crew and a restrained smile to Mary. She said nothing about the temporary nature of the original mural, nor did she mention fines or citations. For once, she merely observed in silence before leaving. 2 weeks later, The carpenter completed work on the mural frames. Mary decided to mount 3 large sections on her backyard wall, facing the new fence. She invited the neighborhood to a small unveiling ceremony. It was a casual affair, just a few folding chairs, some iced tea, and pastries laid out on a table. When a moment came, Mary pulled the cloth drapes away, revealing the 3 framed panels of the original mural. Each panel showcased a different slice of the communal artwork: swirling autumn leaves, silhouettes of neighbors holding hands, and bright, childlike images of flowers and sunshine. The crowd broke into applause, some even wiping away tears. Janet put an arm around Mary's shoulders. "They look perfect," she whispered. Indeed, the wooden frames complemented the painted boards, making them look like legitimate pieces of gallery art rather than fragments of an old fence. Over time, those 3 panels became a conversation piece whenever Mary had guests. She loved explaining how an act of hate had been transformed into a message of unity, and how her neighbors had rallied to protect not only her home, but the broader community spirit. It was a story that resonated far beyond Maplewood Estates, thanks to news segments and social media posts. As for the new fence, it stood tall and sturdy, meeting every single HOA requirement. Mary felt secure knowing she no longer faced constant threats of fines. Yet every time she glanced at the wooden frames bearing the old mural, she was reminded of the neighborly love that truly made Maplewood Estates feel like home. Over the next couple of months, Maplewood Estates settled into a relaxed routine. The occasional friction remained. Someone's dog barked too loudly. A teen blasted music late into the night. But these were handled with civil conversation rather than HOA crackdowns. The newly revamped board focused on community-building events and constructive communication, leaving Brenda somewhat marginalized. At the next annual HOA election, Brenda decided not to run again. She announced it in a curt email, citing personal reasons. Some suspected she simply lacked the support to win re-election. Others guessed she was tired of being the neighborhood pariah. Either way, her exit was met with a collective sigh of relief. While no one wished her ill, it was clear that Maplewood Estates had outgrown her heavy-handed leadership. In her absence, the HOA established a new code enforcement policy that encouraged homeowners to assist each other rather than punish them. Residents volunteered for beautification days, where they helped mow lawns, paint shutters, and tend gardens for anyone struggling to keep up with maintenance. The result was a friendlier, more vibrant neighborhood, a far cry from the tense atmosphere that once prevailed. Mary continued her quiet life in her beloved home. She spent afternoons on her porch swing, sometimes gazing at her framed fence panels with a soft smile. She baked her famous apple pies for new neighbors, welcoming them with the same warmth that once defined the old Maplewood Estates. One evening, Mary was looking through an old photo album when she came across a picture of Fred standing beside the fence he had built decades ago. She studied his broad smile, the pride in his eyes as he held a hammer in one hand. The fence in the photo was pristine then, no rotten boards, no cracks. In its place now stood a brand new structure, but Mary felt certain Fred would have approved of how things had turned out. She felt a pang of sadness that Fred couldn't witness the mural or the community that had embraced her after the vandalism. But she also felt deep peace knowing that his legacy, a sense of home and warmth, lived on in the neighbors who banded together for her sake. Sometimes she could almost hear Fred's voice in her head, cheering on their transformation of Get Out into a spectacle of love. Mary closed the album, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. As she moved to the backyard, she paused in front of the framed mural panels. Each brushstroke was a testament to her neighbor's kindness. She ran her fingers over the painted leaves and silhouettes, recalling that terrifying night when she first discovered the graffiti. What had begun as a hateful act intended to isolate her had ultimately woven the community closer. It was a powerful reminder of how adversity can sometimes be the catalyst for profound unity. Though Maplewood Estates was just one suburban neighborhood, news of its mural project and community turnaround spread. A few months later, A neighboring development invited Janet and Mary to speak at a small local gathering on community conflict resolution. They shared the story, from the intimidation tactics of Brenda, whom they referred to more diplomatically in public forums, to the day everyone came together to paint a mural over hateful words. Mary felt butterflies before stepping up to the microphone, but once she started speaking, the entire audience leaned in, captivated by the tale of how neighbors could stand up to aggression with collective goodwill. By the time she finished, the room gave her a standing ovation. Afterwards, a couple who managed a senior living facility approached Mary. They said her story had inspired them to create a mural project of their own, fostering unity among their residents. Mary smiled, remembering how uncertain she'd felt that cold night when she first glimpsed the graffiti. Little could she have known that it would spark a chain reaction, touching lives far beyond Maplewood Estates. Months later, Mary woke early on a mild summer morning. The sun filtered through her curtains, creating a soft glow across her bedroom floor. She slipped into her robe and made her way to the kitchen. After brewing a cup of coffee, she stepped onto her back porch, where the newly installed fence still looked fresh. On the adjacent wall hung the 3 framed mural panels. Their colors, though slightly faded from exposure, remained vibrant enough to remind her of that day of transformation. She sipped her coffee, letting the warmth of the morning light envelop her. The neighborhood beyond her fence felt calm, safe, and welcoming, a stark contrast to the fear she once experienced. In the distance, she heard children laughing, someone's lawnmower humming, a dog barking excitedly. Even the rustle of leaves seemed more joyful now. Maplewood Estates had found its heart again, and in a bedroom somewhere else in the neighborhood, Brenda Harwood, still referred to as Karen in certain whispered corners, went about her routine, no longer wielding the gavel of the HOA. Perhaps she contemplated her past actions with a pang of regret, or perhaps she remained stubbornly convinced she was right all along. Either way, the community had moved on. They had chosen to stand up for Mary, and by extension, for each other. No official citation or threatened fine could ever match the sheer force of neighbors uniting for a cause of love and support. The old fence, once marred by hateful words, now lived on as cherished artwork and a collective memory, a testament to the resilience and empathy that define the true spirit of a neighborhood. As Mary gazed at the framed mural, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for her neighbors, for the legacy she and Fred had built, and for the new chapter of harmony in Maplewood Estates. She whispered a quiet thank you to the morning air, stepped back inside, and prepared for the day ahead, secure in the knowledge that she was home. In a world where divisive acts can often drive communities apart, Maplewood Estates offered a different narrative. One of neighbors choosing empathy over fear, artistry over destruction, and unity over isolation. Though the antagonist was a single individual whose oppressive tendencies cast a shadow over the neighborhood, the collective light of goodwill proved immeasurably stronger. The story of Mary's fence, how Get Out was transformed into a grand mural, became a local legend, retold at block parties, shared on social media, and passed down through families. It served as a reminder that, no matter how hateful a message might be, a community standing together can paint over it with hope, resilience, and love. And so life went on at Maplewood Estates, with the sun rising day after day over bright lawns and well-tended homes. Children continued to chalk hearts and flowers on driveways, and older residents still waved cheerfully from their porches. In Mary's backyard, the new fence stood tall, meeting every official guideline. Yet behind it, framed for all to see, remained the shimmering remnant of what happens when neighbors say no to intimidation and yes to unity.